All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Class 2B. We're going to be talking about students' favorite class, which is how to share your faith without sounding defensive. So today is not how to preach a sermon, how to preach in a crusade. Today is when you're talking to that person one on one, when you apply what I taught you yesterday, which is witnessing tip number one. When you walk up to somebody and you're like, "Hi, if I gave this to you, would you read it?" And they look at it and they go, "Oh, no, thank you. I don't go to church. Oh, no, thank you. I'm not religious. Oh, no, thank you. I'm Muslim." Or you walk up to somebody and you say, "Hey, I'm giving this away today. If I gave this to you, would you read it?" They go, "Oh, great. I'm already a Christian." Whatever they say, today we're going to learn how to navigate and guide a spiritual conversation. Most Christians have not been taught evangelism. Most Christians have not been taught how to start a conversation. And most Christians have not been taught how to guide a conversation. So today you're going to be learning all of that and very, very practical. And the reason why I have this in the Michigan School of Apologetics is one of the things I've noticed over the years is people don't share their faith because they're afraid they won't have the answers. They're afraid they don't know what to say. They're afraid they're going to misrepresent God or they're going to say something incorrectly. So, what makes today's class so great is that if you understand this material today, God willing, we're going to take all of those fears away from you. Now, there are some people on this call that are very gifted preachers, teachers, crusade evangelists. That's amazing. But today we're going to be talking about just that simple how do I talk to people? How do I guide a conversation? So you notice in your handout on page 13, you'll see the book Tactics. That is Greg Koukl's book. You might be able to find it online or on an e-version, but that is his book Tactics, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. On page 13, Greg Koukl is very big on representing Christ well. And so Greg Koukl wrote something called the Ambassador's Creed. And it's a creed that he often says to himself to remind himself of how to behave in public, how to behave when you're with other people, especially non Christians. So we won't go over this today, but in your free time, I would encourage you to look over page 13 and 14 and look at the Ambassador's Creed. It's a creed to say, how do I conduct myself with people that don't agree with me? Right? If you talk to a Muslim, they could get very upset with you. And so how do you conduct yourself with somebody who doesn't agree with you? And so First Peter chapter 3 says we're to conduct ourselves with gentleness and with respect. So as Greg Koukl often says, if the person I'm talking to gets angry and then I get angry and both of us are angry, well, nobody wins. That's a lose situation. The person is not hearing you. The person is not seeing Jesus. It is a lose situation. So I know that many people, this is how they have an evangelistic conversation. They give their opinion, you give your opinion. They give their opinion, You give your opinion. Nobody's listening. Everybody's trying to trump the other person, and sometimes it doesn't really work. So today we're going to learn a brand new approach, and I hope it's going to take a lot of the fear away from many of you on how to start a conversation and guide a conversation. So now we're going to be on page 15, and we're going to talk about the power of using this tool called tactics. So we're going to be on page 15, and I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Welcome to class 2B. We're going to be jumping right into the material here today. Very encouraging. So again, this is from the book Tactics by Greg Koukl. So today we're going to learn from Greg Koukl how to completely control a conversation. Wow, that would be nice to know, wouldn't it? So this is on the top of page 15. Um, be in the driver's seat in a witnessing encounter. Allow the other person to do most of the work. Wow, well, how do we make the other person that we're witnessing do most of the work? How do you go on the offensive and not sound like it? How about this one? How do you avoid quarrels? How do you escape challenging questions? How do you minimize the awkwardness of a confrontation? I would like to know that, wouldn't you? How do you engage a person productively? How do you come across as thoughtful and interested? How do you be confident in your approach? And one of Greg Koukl's things that he likes to say is, how do you put a stone in someone's shoe in a good way? What does that mean? So, have you ever been walking down the street and you have a little pebble in your shoe, a little stone, and it's just so annoying? It's just like, I got to take my shoe off and get that stone or that pebble out of my shoe. So, Greg Koukl says that this approach is going to be able to put a stone in someone's shoe, meaning maybe we don't have all the answers, maybe we don't know what to say, but we can learn to engage a person productively without yelling, to come across as thoughtful and interested, and then in the end, help a person consider Christ. So if we walk away from a conversation and there's no yelling, there's no arguing, I'm listening to you, you're listening to me, I'm making the other person do most of the work. Wow. Well, how do we do that? How do we make the person that we're witnessing to do most of the work? Well, this is a great quote. This is in your notes here. This is from a man by the name of Hugh Hewitt. He has a talk show here in America. I believe he's probably retired now. But this is what he said. Once you've learned how to guide a conversation, you've also learned how to control it. Let me say that again. Hugh Hewitt said, once you learn how to guide a conversation, you've also learned how to control it. Well, we've never really been taught how to guide a conversation. We've never really been taught how to control a conversation, have we? It's just my opinion, then you give your opinion. One person shouts, then we both shout. But let's today learn a better way. I was reading through the Bible a few years ago, and I was reading through the book of Daniel. And there's not too many people in the Bible that we would consider impeccable, flawless. Joseph is very admirable. He conducted himself pretty well in his later life. Daniel, who was taken captive and sent off to Babylon, it says about Daniel in Daniel chapter 2, verse 14, it says that Daniel spoke to the king with wisdom and tact. And I thought, wow, there's that word tact. That's where Greg Koukl got his book Tactics from. How do you tactfully maneuver a conversation? If I'm talking to a Muslim and I don't know really what to say, what do I do? Well, how do I get the wisdom? How do I talk tactfully? Another word for tactfully is skillfully. Okay. So Daniel spoke with wisdom and he talked skillfully. To talk tactfully or skillfully, you need a lot of training. You need to learn how to guide and control a conversation. So, one of the opinions that people have about apologetics is that you have to know all the answers. I want to tell you today, as a professional apologist, that is a myth. Nobody knows all the answers. I don't know all the answers. So to think that you have to know all the answers to evangelize, to do apologetics, that's not true. So I'm going to teach you today from Greg Koukl how to speak with wisdom and tact, just like Daniel did in the book of Daniel. So let's go and share screen now, and then in your notes on page 15, you notice that I have right there, it says possible situations. Okay. So I have three possible situations. So let's go through these three possible situations, and I'm going to read them to you from your manual. Number one, you're at a friend's house and someone admits they don't believe in God. What do you do? Wow. Someone you thought was a Christian and they admit they don't believe in God. What do you do? How about number two? You're at a Bible study and somebody new says, who are we to push our views on others? And besides, isn't God love anyway? That's something in America we hear. So I'm not sure about Africa, but that's that's something we hear in America. Who are we to push our view on somebody else? And besides, isn't God love anyway? Okay, how about number three? You're on your lunch break at work and you try to share your faith. And your coworker says, I don't believe in the Bible. It was translated over and over again. You can't trust it. Plus, it was written by men. Wow. So think about number one. You would have to be an expert in atheism, how to defend God. That's a hard one. Number two, you would have to be able to defend that. Like, well, who am I to push my view on somebody else? And number three, you would have to be an expert on where we got our Bible and Bible translations and Greek and Hebrew and English and the historicity of the Bible and the trustworthiness of the copies of the Bible. Like, who's an expert in that? Right? And that's a very typical Muslim objection. And so, what do we say to that? Well, let's turn over now to page 16, and we're going to learn about Greg Koukll's simple tactics. So let's say someone says, I don't even believe in God. Who are we to push our views on somebody else? And wasn't the Bible translated over and over? What do you say? So on the top of page 16, this is Greg Koukll's first tactical question. Instead of being an expert on everything, Greg Koukll simply has a tactic which says, what do you mean by that? So someone says they don't believe in God, you say, what do you mean by that? Somebody says, you know what? Who are we to push our view on somebody else? You say, what do you mean by that? Someone says, oh, the Bible, that's written by men. You say, what do you mean by that? Oh, the Bible was so corrupted. It wasn't like the King James. Didn't they corrupt the Bible? All you have to say is, what do you mean by that? Or look underneath that. Here's an amazing question. If someone says they don't believe in God, you can ask, what do you mean by God? Because maybe their concept of God is confused. What kind of God do they believe in? What kind of God do they reject? You could ask a question like, what do you mean by you don't believe? So notice that if someone says to you, I don't believe in God, I just gave 3 questions back to them to make them do the hard work of defending their own claim. Notice that I have not done any defending. Notice that I am not the one talking. I'm not the one in the hot seat. So if someone says, I don't believe in God, you say, what do you mean by that? And then they talk and they confirm that. And then you say, well, what do you mean by God? And they talk and they defend themselves. And then you say, well, now you said you don't believe. So what do you mean by you don't believe? So notice that the person is doing all the work. They're the one talking and defending their own claims. So let's go on to the second one. Someone says, who are we to push our view on somebody else? You can simply say, what do you mean by pushing your views? And they talk and they have to defend themselves. You can say, what do you mean by God is love? So if you're in a Bible study and someone says, you know what? Who are we to push our views on somebody else? And besides, isn't God love anyway? All you have to do is use the first tactical question and say, what do you mean by that? And then what you do is you look for key words, key phrases. You can say things like, what do you mean by pushing your views? What do you mean by God is love? Notice that I'm not upset. Notice that because I have a tactic of how to control and guide a conversation, because I already have a game plan. Notice that I'm not angry. I'm not getting upset. I'm not talking over the other person. The other person is probably going to feel like you're listening to them. Wow, what an amazing concept to think that Christians listen to other people. Wow. I think we all need work on listening to other people, don't we? Especially people who disagree with us. So if you're a person that gets angry quick, this is a great tactic. You know, it's also fun when you do this, you can actually breathe. You don't have to have all the answers. Wow. You're making the other person defend their own crazy claims. How about this last one? This is very common, isn't it? Let's do the last one. So someone says, oh, the Bible was corrupted. Oh, the Bible was written by men. So you start with your first tactical question, and you always start off with, what do you mean by that? And then from there, you go on to find key words, key phrases. Like, what do you mean by the Bible was translated? What do you mean by the Bible was written by men? You see how I'm making the other person defend their own claims. So think about this in real life. Let's say you live in a neighborhood and you have one neighbor that's great. The other neighbor is very bad. And one day you get a knock on the door and your neighbor, your bad neighbor is accusing you of stealing their bicycle and stealing some of their goats or stealing some of their chickens. You'd be like, I'm not guilty. I didn't do that. Well, in a court of law, what happens? The person on the in the court of law says, "Sir, did you see him steal your chickens? What do you mean by he stole your goats? What do you mean by he stole your bicycle? When did that happen? How did that happen? What time of day did that happen? Did anybody see it happen?" Notice that in a court of law, a lawyer is going to ask questions to find out the truth. But as Christians, we don't do that very well. We want to be the expert. We want to show them they're wrong. We want to quote the Bible at them. But in real life, lawyers and courts of law, they ask 4 or 5, 6 questions to get at the truth. What do you mean by that? What do you mean the Bible was translated? What do you mean by corrupted? When was it corrupted? What parts of the Bible are corrupted? When was it corrupted? Make the other person who makes the claim do the work. Does that make sense? If I say, my neighbor killed my dog, well, the lawyer is going to ask me, well, where were you? Where was the dog? What time of day did that happen? How do you know that? Is there any eyewitnesses to the fact? But why don't we do that when we're talking to non-Christians? Do you know what I think it is? Because I've done this for 30 years. It's pride. We talk too much, we yell too much, and I know my own heart very often is pride. I want to be right. Okay, let's keep it real. Is anybody on the Zoom call married? Does anybody on the Zoom call have a ring on? Right? My wife and I will be married 29 years this summer. Okay. So anybody who's been married more than 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, what happens between a husband and a wife? You want to be right. You argue because you want to be right. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches to talk less, listen more. My wife says, you always come in the house with your shoes on and it brings mud all over the house. I could say, you know what? It's my house. I could say, well, I don't bring mud into the house. You know what? You need just to sweep it up. That's not very kind of me, is it? That's not very godly of me, is it? I could look at my wife and say, oh, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Well, you always come in the house and you bring your shoes in the house. Oh, you mean like my shoes? Yeah, your shoes, your work shoes. Don't bring your work shoes in the house. So you're saying like, don't bring my work shoes in the house. Yeah, don't bring your shoes in the house. So you're saying like, leave my shoes outside. Yes, leave your shoes outside. That would really help me out. You don't have to argue. You can use the same tactics. So if a Muslim says the Bible's been corrupted, first of all, that Muslim probably doesn't know anything. He's only repeating what he's heard. So make that poor Muslim do the work of defending this claim. You know, my neighbor killed my dog. Well, you're going to have to defend that. That's stupid. Do you know how stupid it is to say the Bible's been corrupted? First of all, they're not scholars. Second of all, they've never read the Bible. And third, as Frank says, they're parroting. That's correct. They're only parroting what they've heard. So how you get out of this trap is you make them do the work. You say, wow, the Bible's been corrupted. Like, what do you mean by that? Well, you know, the Bible has 66 books in it. Which book are you talking about? When was it corrupted? The Bible's been around 2,000 years. How about this one? Who corrupted it? How about this one? How do you know that? How about this one? Do you have any evidence for that? Can you prove that to me? Notice that I'm not yelling. I'm trying to be calm. I'm breathing. And I'm making this poor Muslim do all the work of defending this audacious claim that he can't defend. Do you know what happens when someone realizes they actually don't know the answers? They actually stop talking. So when the other person stops talking, that means now's your time to share the gospel because they realize they really don't know what they're talking about. So in your notes here on the bottom, I love this next point. So I've kind of said it already, but it's just so powerful. Look in your notes here on page 16. Asking questions back accomplishes many things. So let's talk about that. It forces the other person to think, wow, that's a light bulb. That's a new idea. You're actually making the person think, wow. Because all they're doing is parroting what they've heard. You know, the Pope is the head of the church. The Pope is infallible. The Roman Catholic Church is infallible. You say, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by infallible? How do you know that? Can you give me any evidence for that? You're making the other person think. It makes the other person do the work. If you are sincere, you're going to come across as friendly and interested. This is a good one. You can actually get an education and it puts you in fact finding mode, almost like a private investigator. What does a private investigator do? A private investigator doesn't yell. A private investigator asks questions. So if you're preaching, preach. But if you're in a conversation, learn to ask questions, learn to be a detective. Does that make sense? At the bottom of your page, on page 16, it says, according to nationally syndicated radio talk show host Hugh Hewitt, we should ask at least a half dozen questions in every conversation. So less talking, less making statements at first, and ask questions. Be a private detective. Now, there will be a time to preach, there will be a time to share the gospel. So, this is what I call pre evangelism. So, we're not talking about sharing the gospel yet. We're just talking about starting a conversation, guiding a conversation, making the other person do the work of defending their own claims, making the other person realize they really don't know what they're talking about. That's very powerful to do. It really is like, you know, when you farm and the ground is hard, you've got to dig and you've got to dig and you know, get that hard soil. If you threw seed on that hard soil, right, it just bounces off. We have to do the same in evangelism. Why are we throwing seed on hard ground? Do the hard work of digging, asking questions, making the other person do the work. It's going to take time for you to learn the art of patience. Wow. Patience and evangelism often doesn't go together, does it? But we can work on that, can't we? Okay, so now you're probably wondering, well, what do we do next? I mean, what do you do after you ask these questions? So now we're on the page 17, and this is Greg Kokel's second tactical question. which is a wonderful, wonderful question. I love this question. His next question is this. After you ask him all these questions, you say, huh, now how did you come to that conclusion? Boom. You put the burden right back on them. The Pope is the head of the church. How did you come to that conclusion? The Pope is infallible. How did you come to that conclusion? Joseph Smith is the prophet of the Mormon church. How did you come to that conclusion? Muhammad is the final and best prophet. How did you come to that conclusion? Do you see that once you've learned how to guide a conversation, you have learned now how to control it? Okay, I love this. I love this next point from Greg Kokel. I took it from his book. This is in your notes. Oh, I gotta do something else. So no, I gotta do this first. Top of page 17. I need to keep this in order, so sorry about that. This is really, really good. Okay, top of page 17. So let's talk about this. The very first question, what do you mean by that? It helps you know what the other person thinks. So that's in your notes. You got to write that down. The first question, what do you mean by that? It helps you know what the other person thinks. And that's very helpful in counseling, in evangelism, in apologetics. I really need to know what the other person thinks. We need to dig deep. Now, the second question, how did you come to that conclusion, helps you know why they think the way they do. Isn't that really good? The first question, what do you mean by that, helps you know what the other person thinks. And the second question, how did you come to that conclusion, helps you know why they think the way they do. Isn't that good? Isn't that good? It's a new way of doing pre-evangelism. It's a new way to break up the ground, to make room for the gospel. So I like what Greg Kokel said here on page 17 on this quote. Some people think Christians are the only ones who need to answer for their beliefs. Can we say yes and amen to that? Can we say yes and amen to that? Some people think Christians are the only ones who need to answer for their beliefs. Not true. Somebody says, I don't believe in God. Guess what? I don't believe that. So make the person who makes the claim, make them defend that. What do you mean by that? What do you mean you don't believe? What do you mean you don't believe in God? Which God do you not believe in? How did you come to that conclusion? Do you have any evidence for that? What will happen to you if you die and you're wrong? Is it worth really betting your whole life on that? So you mean there's absolutely no evidence for God whatsoever? That's a big claim. What do you mean? What do you mean by no evidence? What do you mean by evidence? What evidence would make you happy? I've just asked 10, 12 questions, guys. I'm making the other person do the work. Just like in a court of law, the guy on the witness stand has to defend themselves. We have literally turned it around where people make these audacious claims. The Bible has been corrupted by the King James, and just stop it. You don't know it. You're not a scholar. So let the person defend themselves. Now, this is really cool. This next point is really quite astounding. I was teaching this once, and there was a lawyer in the classroom, and he actually slammed his hands down on the table and said, "This is what we learn in law school." So this is what they learn in law school. So let's go to this next point. This is pretty cool. Quite astounding. Here we go. Here it is. Whoever makes a claim bears the burden of proof. So that's in your notes. Whoever makes the claim, in your blank there should be bears the burden of proof. So that's a big key takeaway. Whoever makes a claim bears the burden of proof. So if someone says this, Jesus was an alien. Jesus was an alien. He came from outer space and he's an alien? Yeah. I think Jesus was a green alien. Well, you don't have to defend that. Make the other person who makes the claim, they are responsible for the burden of proof. Think about Mormonism. Okay, this is so ridiculous. Mormonism, 1800 years after Jesus, in northern United States, is in the woods. And he says he was visited by an angel who told him all the churches and everything's been corrupted, and the truth needs to be reinstated back on the earth. So now God is appointing Joseph Smith now to bring the new truth, to reinstate the truth back on the earth. That's why it's called the Church of Latter-day Saints. So all you have to do is ask a Mormon, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? How do you know that? Is there any evidence for that? Is there any evidence in world history that the Bible had been totally corrupted, that all the truth had been wiped out? How do you know that? How do you know that Joseph Smith wasn't visited by a bad angel? Hmm. Last time I checked, there's good angels and bad angels. So how do you know he wasn't visited by a bad angel? Right? So whoever makes the claim bears the responsibility of the burden of proof. Wow. Game changer, right? It's what they use in courts of law. So now here's this little paragraph. It says, Greg Kokel says, people should be able to give reasons for important things they think are true. Instead of letting our critics have a free ride, we make them defend their beliefs or unbelief, as the case may be. I call this reversing the burden of proof. Right? Pretty amazing. So now let's look at the very last part of our page on page 17. And this grid, this little circle grid, this little graph, I should say, not a grid, this graph is really like your visual game plan on what to do. So next week, we're going to talk about next steps. Well, what do you do after you do this? And how do you get to the gospel? We're going to talk about that next week. But first, we need a game plan. We need a strategy. We need tactics. So So, really, guys, think about this. If you understand what I'm teaching you, how do we win the world for Jesus? How do we get the gospel out into our cities? How do we talk to people confidently? You be like Jesus and you start the conversation. You walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, my name is Aaron. I'm giving this away today. If I gave this to you, would you read it?" And they take it and they go, "Oh, is this Christian?" I say, "Yeah, we're Christians. I just want you to know that God loves you and I want you to know the gospel." "Oh, I don't believe in that religion stuff." What do you say? You've started the conversation. You're being an evangelist. You're being like Jesus. So now this guy goes, "I don't want any of that religion stuff." Look at your chart. Look at the bottom of page 17. Look at your chart. So I just made up a scenario. Okay. I just made this up. So, number one, you start the conversation. The other person says, "I don't care about that religion stuff." Your first question is always what? What do you mean by that? So now you're making the other person explain what they believe, not you. "Well, I was raised in church and they were such hypocrites." You're looking for key words and key phrases. So look at 1A. Huh, I'm sorry to hear that. What do you mean by hypocrites? "Yeah, I think all those people in churches, all they want is your money." Huh. So when you say all they want is money, what do you mean by money? "Yeah, all these greedy preachers, all they do is manipulate people to get your money." Okay, so when you say manipulate, what do you mean by manipulate? "Yeah, they're just like talking about money all the time." Okay, so when you say all the time, what do you mean by all the time? Like, "Yeah, they talk about money too much." Too much? Yeah, too much. Okay. How did you come to that conclusion? Well, I think all churches are corrupted. I mean, I think the church is just one big money-making machine. They're all corrupted. Okay. So look at 2A. Um, Sir, can you give me any reasons or facts to support your conclusion that every single church in the whole world is wrong or evil? Can you give me a factual reason that every single church in the whole world, all they want is your money? Can you prove that? Like, I go to church. Are you saying that my church is corrupted? I mean, you've never been there. So how do you know that? So how can you say every church is corrupted? Well, I guess I can't. Okay. I'm sorry that you had a bad experience, but yeah, we really can't say every church, all they want is your money. Does that make sense? Because we haven't been in every church. Does that make sense? I have a game plan. I'm never stuck. I'm never stuck. Guys, I have been to Harvard University, in the most intellectual place in the world. I'm not a scientist. So how do I talk to a scientist? The same way. I'm not a Muslim apologist. How do I talk to a Muslim? The same way. Isn't that beautiful, guys? So next week, we're going to talk about what do we do next? What are some more questions we can do? And then after that, how do we get to the gospel? So if this was enlightening to you, I'm so glad that you're here. And I pray that this was very influential on your life today. So thank you very much.